Opening the door for queenside development, this knight's advance subtly prepares for central pawn breaks. Mirroring white's knight development, black establishes an immediate symmetrical pawn structure, hinting at a possible king's Indian defense or Nimzo-Indian setup. Preparing to fianchetto, the bishop offers a flexible queenside development. Embracing the fianchetto allows black to prepare a robust kingside defense, aiming for harmonious development and a flexible pawn structure. Developing the bishop to a strong diagonal prepares kingside castling and pressures black's queenside pawn structure. Developing the bishop to its best diagonal solidifies the fianchetto and eyes the queenside. Fortifying the kingside pawn structure offers robustness, preparing for a potential fianchetto or a solid central presence. Securing the monarch swiftly initiates black's development, aiming to connect pieces and prepare counterplay. This establishes the fianchettoed bishop as a defensive anchor, solidifying the kingside's structural integrity. Centralizing the pawn solidifies control and opens diagonals for the bishop. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure now frees up potential pawn breaks in the center or queenside, preparing for piece development and central control. E5 boldly contests the center, initiating pawn skirmishes and potentially opening lines toward the queenside. Solidifying the center with this pawn push now prepares to potentially open the queenside or reinforce the d4 square. Developing the knight to c6 strengthens the central pawn chain and prepares for a potential Re8 or d5 push while also contesting key squares. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain, this advances white's territorial ambitions. Preventing bg5, this move subtly anchors the kingside pawn structure, creating potential space for future maneuvering while keeping the king secure. 9. nc3 initiates knight development, preparing for central pawn advances while offering a strong defensive screen for the white king. Developing the bishop to this square initiates a subtle piece coordination, aiming to secure central influence and prepare for pawn advances on the queenside. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential kingside pawn push. Unlocking the center with a pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's space and opens lines for his pieces. Clearing the queen's path aims to activate her onto the queenside, potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance or attacking vulnerable pieces. Bringing the rook to the open e-file creates a potent battery with the bishop, eyeing white's central pawn structure. Centralizing the rook on the d-file fortifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential d4 breaks. This pawn thrust boldly grabs central space, creating a blockade that aims to restrict white's queenside development and prepare for a potential kingside attack. Exchanging pawns here decisively opens the central files, creating immediate tactical opportunities and forcing black to confront the structural changes. Opening that center diagonal grants active piece play, but now the pawn structure is fractured and the king's safety may become a concern. A bold knight sortie to b5, immediately challenging black's central pawn structure and aiming to disrupt coordination. Exploring the knight's retreat to h7, seeking to reposition it towards potential kingside opportunities or reinforcing the d6 pawn. Repositioning the rook to defend the weak d4 pawn and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Challenging the bishop's placement, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. Shifting the queen to f, one aims to support the c4 pawn and potentially join an attack on the kingside. Unleashing an annoying pawn jab to disrupt white's queenside ambitions and gain a foothold for the knight. Reclaiming central presence, the knight aims to challenge black's well-established pawn chain and open attacking avenues. Unleashing the queen to target the kingside and prepare for potential pawn storms injects dynamism into black's position. Repositioning the knight to the king's wing, preparing a kingside assault and potential outpost on f3. Unleashing the queen aggressively might overextend, exposing your king's safety amidst white's tightening grip. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, this aggressive advance cracks open lines, potentially exposing the black monarch to immediate threats and creating fascinating attacking possibilities. Asserting pressure on the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the open c-file later. Reinforcing the king's defense while preparing a rook lift to a more active square, potentially challenging black's central pawn structure. Recentering the knight to f6 intends to reclaim central influence and prepare for potential pawn pushes, though it vacates the g4 square for white's bishop. Repositioning the knight to c2 aims to build pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially support a future kingside attack. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for potential queenside expansion with b5. Preventing any immediate kingside breakthrough, this pawn advances to solidify white's pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside maneuvering. Initiating a knight maneuver to the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. Shifting the king to the h-file offers crucial diagonal escape and dodges potential queenside harassment. Boldly challenging white's central grip, this pawn thrust opens lines and creates immediate tactical possibilities. A tactical reshuffle, trading off a bishop to simplify and potentially exploit the weakened pawn structure. Opening a crucial pawn chain, and the b-file, black strategically dismantles white's queenside structure, potentially creating weaknesses for future infiltration. Opening the queenside for counterplay, this thrust immediately challenges black's pawn structure while eyeing the d4 square. Unbalancing the queenside pawn structure is risky. Focus on king safety now. Exchanging the bishop simplifies the position, potentially opening lines for white's rooks and centralizing the queen. Unleashing a pawn storm is audacious, but it exposes your king to the rampant knight. Unleashing the pawn storm gambit, white seeks to shatter black's defensive structure with an aggressive pawn advance. Unleashing a knight assault, black boldly challenges white's central structure and king's immediate safety. Unlocking the kingside with a decisive queen maneuver, white aims to exploit the g4 pawn's advanced position and create attacking chances. Liberating the bishop from its passive post, black initiates a thematic pawn sacrifice to open lines against white's monarch. Opening a critical diagonal, this knight maneuver aims to exploit the exposed king and shatter black's pawn structure. Black recaptures material, but that exchange opens a dangerous diagonal towards your king. Unlocking the queenside's potential, white aims to exploit the now exposed king. Recapturing the pawn with the queen unlocks potential counterplay, but sacrifices a tempo and eases white's central pressure. Reactivating the knight to a central outpost unlocks the queen's assault potential. Unleashing a knight into the enemy camp, this daring foray aims to disrupt white's harmonious setup and exploit the overextended pawns. Asserting central space dominance, this thrust aims to disrupt black's knight and secure white's pawn chain. Sensing a positional advantage, black aims to consolidate central control and prepare for further pawn advances. Simplifying the position now, white aims to exploit the open files and gain a favorable endgame imbalance. Opening the c-file opens a new avenue for the rook to exploit the weakened pawn structure. Reactivating the knight by bringing it through g2 prepares a potential kingside assault and reclaims central influence. Reclaiming the initiative, black redirects pressure towards the queenside, aiming to exploit white's scattered pieces. Securing the open file for the rook, this maneuver prepares for a potential kingside pawn push, aiming to cramp black's position. Sacrificing material to break open lines for your queen and rook creates dynamic counterplay against white's king. Unleashing the knight's potential to disrupt the pawn chain and explore central weaknesses. Repositioning the rook to the second rank immediately pressures the isolated queen's pawn, hinting at a desperate endgame fight. Repositioning the knight to a more active central square threatens discoveries and aims to bolster the queenside push. Exploiting the open file, black aims to shatter white's pawn structure and activate the rook. This knight sacrifice aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines, potentially leading to an advantage in the ensuing liquidation. Seizing an unguarded pawn initiates a flurry of activity, but neglects crucial piece development for the king's defense. Reactivating the pinned knight offers a glimmer of hope by creating counterplay, though it faces immense pressure. Re-establishing piece activity, Black aims to rejoin the central fight and avoid being sidelined by White's active rook. Clearing the knights from the center could facilitate piece redistribution, aiming to pressure the weakened queenside. The knight's venture to c3 offers a tantalizing outpost, threatening to infiltrate White's weakened queenside pawns and create new tactical possibilities. Reclaiming the rook on a2 finally stabilizes the queenside after Black's persistent intrusion. Recapturing the rook with the knight opens up the file for Black's rook and creates a passed pawn on the queenside. Unleashing the passed pawn's power is paramount to breaking through Black's defensive wall. Re-establishing the bishop's influence aims to disrupt White's pawn majority and create counterplay on the queenside. Opening the b-file offers the chance to infiltrate the enemy position, potentially creating new avenues for attack. Repositioning the king to safety is paramount now that the queens are off the board and White's pieces are mobilizing. Activating the rook to penetrate the 7th rank, threatening decisive disruption. Desperate attempts to disrupt the rook's dominance on the 7th rank, but the passed pawn on c6 will prove decisive. Activating the knight's central presence, forcing a decisive exchange and simplifying into a favorable endgame. The king ventures out, seeking refuge and activation in this complex endgame. Unleashing a decisive discovered check to disrupt the king's safety and force material concessions. Relocating the king to f6 finally brings it into the game's action, though it's still exposed. Capturing that pawn opens a critical diagonal, potentially exposing Black's isolated king to swift attack. The knight's retreat to c1 suddenly unlocks the rook's attack on the 1st rank, creating new tactical possibilities for White. Unlocking the b-file with the rook offers a fresh assault route against Black's vulnerable king. A desperate attempt to disrupt the winning endgame, sacrificing a knight for a fleeting glimmer of counterplay. Exploiting the open king's diagonal, this pawn push secures a vital outpost and strains Black's defenses. Exploiting the open file is paramount now, threatening the king directly. Unleashing the knight through the pawn sacrifice clears a vital path for your king. Capturing the knight opens a critical diagonal for your king, but exposes it to potential checks along the back rank. Sacrificing the knight opens a decisive path to Black's exposed king. Exposing the king on the dark squares proved disastrous, and this capture confirms the inevitable material loss. Clearing the path for the rook to exploit open lines and pressure the weakened Black kingside. This knight's sortie to b4 creates a diversion, probing for tactical weaknesses in White's pawn structure. Pivoting the rook to the queenside now eyes the vulnerable knight and aims to disrupt Black's coordination. Black's rook must stay active, defending the pawn and preparing to attack the weakened White king. Striking at the isolated knight disrupts Black's pawn structure and opens lines for White's rooks. Capturing the rook opens a crucial diagonal, aiming to disrupt White's material advantage and consolidate Black's position. Sacrificing the rook to exploit the vulnerable king and simplify into a winning endgame. The rook's check injects immediate chaos, forcing the White king into a precarious, exposed position. Protecting the king from immediate checks is paramount, but this action also exposes White to further pawn advances and potential rook pressure. A final desperate attempt to leverage the open file and disrupt White's dominant rook. The king's journey through the center offers a fleeting moment of potential escape before facing the inevitable onslaught. A desperate king maneuver, seeking a perpetual check to avoid the inevitable. Embracing the perpetual check seems the only path to survival for White, a concession to the inevitable draw. Delving into the stark emptiness, this check forces the White king into a precarious dance along the back rank. The king's exposed position now invites a final push to capture the remaining enemy pieces. Checking the king's escape squares with this timely check creates immediate complications. The rook now controls the open c-file, a crucial advantage. The king's exposed position now allows a swift pawn advance, potentially creating a passed threat. The knight repositions to solidify central control and prepare for pawn advances.